I am Mira Ghani. I'm your host today. I represent Ecolise, which is a network of community-led initiatives. And this webinar is being organized by BirdLife, WWF, Rewilding Europe, the European Environmental Bureau, and the German Center for Integrative Biodiversity Research. And today's topic, as you know, which you signed up for, is rewilding, putting nature back on the map. With that, I'd like to start introducing us well to our keynote speaker, Michael Wejcik. Michael is an associate professor in ecology. He specializes in landscape ecology, entomology, and management of protected areas. Next to research and lecturing at the Technical University at the Faculty of Ecology and Environmental Science, he's been engaged as a part of various expert groups in the preparation of strategic documents at a national level, including the strategy of protection of UNESCO sites in ancient and primeval beech forests in the Carpathian and other regions in Europe. Currently, he's involved in setting the strategy of nature tourism in Slovakia, and as of July 2019, he is a member of the European Parliament, representing the Slovakia's Party Together political party, which is affiliated with the EPP group. So, Michael, over to you.
Thank you very much, and also for the nice introduction. I didn't know that I provided the translation of my curriculum vitae, so it's very good to hear that you have really the proper data. I'm really pleased to be invited into your event. It seems to be a mass event, more than 470 participants. I didn't expect that. And we should be talking about the rewilding, the putting nature back on the map, and it's really my privilege to have the open speech. So I will go on, if you allow. When preparing for this speech, I checked the Rewilding Europe site, and there I found almost everything that we should really keep in our mind when thinking about rewilding, what it is. And there were those 4 quotas. It's about nature's own ways, bringing back wildlife, ensuring well-being, and delivering for the future. And I think that this is really everything that we should probably know about this topic. And I could finish right now in this very moment, but of course I will provide you with my own insight into this topic. But definitely it probably will be, or very clearly will be about nature. But what actually is the nature? That's probably the good question, because by the word nature, we can understand different things. For instance, Oxford Dictionary defines nature as all the animals, plants, rocks, etc. in the world, and all the features, forces, and processes that happen or exist independently of people. The Slovak Dictionary, for instance, defines the word nature as sum of all things and phenomena that are not a result of direct human action and intervention, which is quite interesting position, because there wouldn't be much nature out there in Europe, at least, if we took this strict definition. Yet in our strategic actions, also when implementing the biodiversity strategy for 2030, which comes with a slogan, bringing nature back into our lives, we need to come as close as possible to this definition, because not everything that we see is green is really nature, and not everything with trees is forest. For many ecosystems, the nature comes in its most beautiful, most complex, and the most biodiverse form only by non-intervention. And by bringing nature back, we should therefore mean ceasing active management, at least in fraction of these ecosystems. At an international conference on forest that was held on February 2020 in Brussels, where I was also invited as a panelist by the European Commission, there was a keynote speaker, Mr. Wolleben, well-known author of a beautiful book, The Hidden Life of Trees. And he really expressed it well when he said, if somebody tells you that he can increase biodiversity by management, he's either completely clueless or he's leading you on. He definitely was referring to forests where this really indeed might be the case. The Commission guidance documents on how to manage habitats of community importance also say that the precise nature of the measures needs to be determined on the side-by-side basis so that they correspond to the ecological requirements of species or habitats present in some area, and in that regard, strict protection may be needed. It has already been more than a year in my mandate as a member of the European Parliament, and I still really cannot grasp how difficult it is to accept these concepts of strict protection, of non-intervention, and how rigid, unyielding, and opinionated the refusal of it is in the European policy environment. The opposition to scientifically sustained understanding that ecologically there is no better forest than a primary forest does not stop at saying that the tree plantation could be equally valuable. I even heard many people saying that forest will degrade or even die if we do not manage it. So apparently there was somebody who planted the first forest 365 million years ago. Of course, not everything that is a result of human intervention should be stripped of the title nature, and there is nowadays a conscious human action that brings nature back. If done well, and it can really work. And the biodiversity strategy really references strongly to it as an ecosystem restoration. The biodiversity strategy 2030 is a very pertinent point of departure for our action to bring nature back on the map and into our lives. Around 10% of Europeans' terrestrial and marine area should be strictly protected by 2030. Also, member states will have to ensure that at least 30% of species and habitats not currently in favorable status are in that category or show a strong positive trend. Strict protection are not applicable actions for every type of ecosystems, but from what we know about ecological nature of species, some of the restoration and conservation action just should comprise rewilding. The objectives of the biodiversity strategy are not welcomed by everyone, unfortunately. In the European Parliament, we can observe that the ENVI Committee endorsed the 2030 targets on protected areas, including forest and restoration, in line with the EU's biodiversity strategy. But on the other hand, the Agri Committee, that's really a very different story. It voted down an amendment reiterating the earlier call of the whole European Parliament for the EU-wide legally binding target to restore degraded habitats by 2030, including natural forests, in the own initiative report on the EU forest strategy. In Agri, on top of it, in the compromise amendments, the term restoration is used only in connection to reforestation of degraded land unsuitable for agricultural use. Other concepts which is challenged and which is very relevant is the conservation and restoration as a win-win solution both for climate and environment, highlighted also in the IPCC climate change and land report. The Agri and ENVI committees, again, disagree also on this. Agri voted against the recognition of conservation and restoration ecosystem as useful climate action, while basically the same reading was endorsed by ENVI committee. I really don't understand how we can simply just vote down any recognition of ecosystems as our climate allies, and seeing any proposal to improve management or to consider non-intervention as a legitimate choice of management and attack against landowners and landholders and an attempt of compromising one's freedom. Of course, without proper governance, without enough transparency and inclusion into the process, insufficient funding, without compensation or incentive measures as applicable, any action can go wrong. But we cannot stop this discussion before it starts due to vested interests by censoring and refusing science in policy and by spreading misinformation about Brussels touching upon our freedom. It is of paramount importance that we accept to move to the point where we agree that this is a necessity and we work together for restoration legislation plans jointly being a success. But there are also good examples, and I am pleased that I can name some of them which come from my home country. Slovakia might just start to do its part and is currently planning to establish a strict nature reserve primary forest of Slovakia, consisting of remnants of primary forest spread around Slovakia, of their buffer zones and corridors between them. There is also an unprecedented chance to finally approve a zero quota for wolf hunt in Slovakia as well. And a third good story is also that we have observed the nesting of European roller after 28 years, where it has become technically extinct from Slovakia, and its return on the reintroduction of proper pasture management. So really, the rewilding really works, even on the national level. It may encompass really various activities, but it definitely can be success when public, stakeholders, and politics really look for the same goals. And it is for all respective policies to coherently work together. Common agriculture policy, recovery, and just transition planning, climate policy, restoration, and nature framework, so that we all are winners in this initiative. And I hope for the rewilding activities will be a story of success, because it's all about nature and it's all about life. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really insightful and really giving us kind of a framing of what the conversation is going to be like. And just while I mentioned that, we will also be running a poll just now, where we'll hopefully list a few options for you to see what you'll be learning about today or hearing about today. So it should come up now, and please vote. Go ahead and vote. Thank you. So it seems like there's an interest in all the topics that we'll be talking about, especially the EU's role in nature restoration. But with that, I'd like to invite our next speaker, Dr. Nestor Fernandez, who is a bioscientist, and he is currently with the German Center for Integrative Biodiversity Research. And he is also leading this project that's being presented today, together with Rewilding Europe, BirdLife Europe, WWF EPO, and the European Environmental Bureau. So I hand over the floor to you, Nestor.
Thank you, Mera. Thank you very much. And thank you, Michal, for a very strong message in support of useful restoration for biodiversity. I'm going to share my screen, and I hope this works. If not, any of the panelists can inform me. And I'm going to talk today about the results of a project that we have been running in the last years in a partnership, in a very unique partnership between iDiv, Rewilding Europe, WWF European Environmental Bureau, and BirdLife. Almost there. All right. Biodiversity is declining globally. That's no secret. The Living Planet report for year 2020 that has appeared right today is showing that globally the population of vertebrate animals are dropping alarmingly by 68% since 1970. But there is one specific characteristics of those declines is that they don't affect in the same way to all species. They affect differently depending on the characteristics of the species. And for example, declines are being observed in species that are large, in large-sized species, sometimes called megafauna, to the extent that over the centuries, most of these species have been confined to a miniature of their former ranges. And it's not only that those species are declining and then their populations are in risk of extinction, it is also that by losing those species, we are losing also the ecological functions that they provide. For example, cascading effects, like the ones that large carnivores, like the real lynx in the top left picture here, are able to control other species in the communities and right down even to the vegetation structure. Also the roles, the ecological roles of large herbivores being able to increase the spatial heterogeneity of the vegetation. Or the sanitary services provided by scavengers like vultures. Vultures in Spain, for example, they are able to remove up to 25,000 tons of carcass every year. Just calculate how much money that could cost to do it by humans. And also, more and more, we know that large animals, the megafauna, have important roles in other ecological processes, like, for example, seed dispersal. But it's not only about the decline of species, it's also about the decline in the quality, in the integrity of ecosystems. Today, 50% of Europe is within 1.5 kilometers of a transportation infrastructure. And if we bring that distance to 5 kilometers, there is almost no land in Europe that is farther away from 5 kilometers from one infrastructure. And also it's about the degradation of ecosystems by human extractions. More than 40% of the potential annual productivity, the natural productivity of the ecosystems in Europe is appropriated by humans. All those impacts on species and ecosystems are almost ubiquitous in Europe. They affect all kinds of ecosystems. So we can see all the reds here in the left. This is an assessment of the IPES on the status of biodiversity and ecosystem services in Europe in the past and the trends to the present. And as I said before, nearly all habitat types, nearly all ecosystem types in Europe are being degraded as today. Now, a recent response of the European Commission and the European Parliament is the EU biodiversity strategy that comes with a very important solution, in my opinion, which is the goals to restore degraded ecosystems and stop any further damage to nature. So this is a tool that can help us not only to stop to halt the declines, but also to start recovering nature all over Europe. But one important question is to define how we address those problems, how we restore nature in a way that is actually beneficial for biodiversity, for climate, and also for people. One proposal is to address this problem under a restoration framework that we have called the Rewilding framework. Many people is is using this concept, but we want to propose here a definition of rewilding that really allows to push conservation and to push restoration forward. And this proposal is based on the definition of three main components of restoration under rewilding. Those three components are important because they determine ecosystem functions and also provide important services to humans. The first component is connectivity. This is how connected are ecosystems. A second component is the trophic complexity, how complex are the trophic webs of species in the ecosystems. And the third component is natural functioning of ecosystems through allowing for stochastic disturbances. Now, those three components are affected by different kinds of constraints. For example, infrastructures that limit the dispersal of individuals and the dispersals of genes and of information across the landscape. Also human-wildlife conflicts that affect particularly the trophic complexity, but also environmental risks. Those constraints bring ecosystems to what is represented in this graph, in the central part, in red, to a status of high degradation. Now the question is, how can we expand that area? How can we take advantage of the space that is still available to nature and increase the integrity of the ecosystems through moving in each of those axes? And at the same time, how can we communicate and promote the benefits of that approach in providing benefits to people that can be non-material, like for example, nature experiences, that can be regulating also, like for example, the capacity of ecosystems to sequester more carbon, or that can be also material. Under this idea, we started to work together with the rest of our consortium on trying to map the possibilities, the potential for rewilding based on the current status of ecosystems in Europe under these three main axes, and the following next three ideas. First, the need to revert the faunation and the fragmentation of ecosystems. Second, to recognize that natural ecosystem dynamics is a key goal for large-scale restoration. And third, to acknowledge also that there are many opportunities providing from passive restoration processes that are already happening in Europe and that we can still promote and boost. Now, I'm going to go through each of those three components that we mapped into what we call an ecological integrity index. And the first component is related to the goal of restoring more complex ecological networks, more complex trophical processes, and specifically about restoring the European megafauna at large scales. So what we did was to compile information on the distributions of all large mammals in Europe at the finest scale possible and to map those distributions. But in addition to map those distributions, we also compared the current status, the current situation of the distribution of, for example, bears, lynx, but also bison, roe deer, red deer, all those species we compared with a counterfactual scenario showing what would be the distribution if humans wouldn't have led many of those populations to extinction. And we also accounted for the functional roles of those species. It means each of those large carnivores and large herbivores have very specific functions in the landscape. So we considered in our indicator the diversity of functions that the species provide. And for example, one of the findings was that only about 5% of the area covered by the European Union preserves or has recovered half or more of the baseline functional diversity. And there is no place in Europe that retains the entire functional diversity in terms of megafauna. The second component is how do we go about restoring connected landscapes that allow for broader dispersal. And for mapping and trying to find opportunities for restoring this component, we used two different sources of information. We focused on infrastructures built by humans. Those are roads, those are railways, cities. But also we look at intensive agriculture. So those two components are very important because they shrink the patches of natural habitats, and they preclude some natural processes to occur because many of those habitats are too small, for example, to host the species, but also to host important ecosystem processes. And we found, for example, that a huge fragmentation of European landscapes, very few, less than 25% of the landscapes in Europe reach the fragmentation limit that we set, which is around patches of 100 square kilometers. But also we found some interesting opportunities. For example, Natura 2000 sites preserve many of the less fragmented landscapes in Europe, both by agriculture and also by infrastructures. And the third component is, and this I'm linking to what Michael said before, is about how to allow ecosystem dynamics and disturbances to occur naturally. Having a forest is not just about having trees, it is about having also all the processes and the natural disturbances within those forests. We assessed the status of forests in Europe and also the status of grasslands through looking at the amount of the productivity of those forests and grasslands that is extracted by humans. And this is what is called, in technical terms, the human appropriation of net primary productivity. In reality, the concept can be simplified as the amount of the production of the systems that is harvested by people. Yeah, and we found that, for example, only around 20% of the European grasslands and forests preserve medium to low levels of harvest. That is, less than 10% of the productivity each year is harvested, while the vast majority of the forests and grasslands are much more heavily impacted. Now, how do we go about combining all those components? What we did was to calculate what we call an ecological integrity index for European landscapes. And what this index indicates is kind of the wildness of the landscape. That is, we wanted to be able to have an index that has higher values in those areas, in those landscapes that have larger patches of nature, but also that are less impacted by the human activity, less appropriation of primary productivity, and preserve a larger proportion of the European megafauna. We compiled all those three axes into a single indicator, and we mapped all that indicator at the highest resolution possible across all Europe. This indicator is useful for several reasons. First of all, it reflects the extent to which those three components of wildness, the faunation, fragmentation of the landscape, and the continued extraction of natural resources, have altered the natural state of ecosystems. But also it's useful to identify suitable conditions for self-sustained nature to be able to support restoration planning. And also it allows us to identify what are the constraints, what are the most important constraints for restoration in each of those three axes. Yeah. So another way of looking at those maps is, for example, to find out where is the 25% highest integrity within each of the European countries. And this is what is shown in the right map here. And based on this, we can support policy planning, and we can support also the identification of areas to reconnect those patches of best preserved areas. And reconnecting is precisely another group of analysis that we can do using these approaches. In the left, I show a map of what are the most suitable landscapes for connecting large clusters of Natura 2000 sites. So here, the aim was to identify if we want to plan for a large European scale network of green infrastructure. So large corridors connecting the best Natura 2000 sites in terms of size and also in terms of ecological integrity. Where should those corridors go? Where should we plan for improving those corridors? And in the picture of the right, in the map of the right, I'm showing some of the most critical corridors that require the implementation of conservation action, but also restoration actions through those pathways. And we can also nicely identify, for example, large Mediterranean corridor that could go from eastern Spain, but go through the Carpathians and so on, and connect up to Greece, and also an eastern corridor that could go from Greece to the Estonia, Lithuania, and Slovakia and Slovenia, and be able to plan for the restoration of those areas and have a large network of connected Natura 2000 sites. So we identified in total more than 100,000 of corridors as priority pathways to restore the cohesion of the Natura 2000 network. And finally, we can use this kind of information and we can focus more specifically in some areas, for example, around cities. What is the availability of nature to people living in cities? So how can we increase the access to wild nature to a majority of people, that is the people that live in the cities, in the European cities. And here to the left, I'm showing a graph of nature. So what are the highest ranking cities regarding the ecological integrity in a buffer, in an area of 50 kilometers around those cities. And we can see that Ljubljana, for example, scores the highest city in Europe, probably the best city to live, according to these maps. And Brussels scores really low. Sorry for living in Brussels. Now, what are some of the take-home messages that I would like to deliver? So how can we go in relation to an EU-level perspective of nature restoration? We think that we should consider, first of all, pursuing ecosystem functions. It's not only about restoring species, it's not only about restoring trees, it's also about restoring all the complex functions that the species, that vegetation, that the landscapes provide to nature and also to people. Second is to improve the coherence and the connectivity of currently protected sites through working on those areas that are better able to connect Natura 2000 sites. Third is to make sure that we plan based on good science, so that we actually do the planning based on scientific assessments that are able to support consistent EU policies, but also national and local scale restoration planning. And the approach that we developed here, we did it at European scale, but similar approaches can be also developed at local scales. And this is one area of research we are currently working on, to be able to translate those tools also to local managers and not only to European level policy. And fourth, we worked until now on terrestrial ecosystems, but similar approaches should be also followed in aquatic ecosystems. So rewilding in aquatic ecosystems is about free-flowing rivers, and it's about allowing to recover the largest species, the migratory fish, and to decrease the amount of fragmentation in European rivers. And with that, I would like to point you to the report that we wrote together with several organizations called Boosting Ecological Restoration for a Wilder Europe. This report is available on the web, and I will be very happy to get questions.
Thank you so much for that, Nestor, and thank you for sharing the report. And I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions. That was a really, really insightful presentation with very concrete recommendations. So thank you for that. We are getting a lot of questions, but before we get into that, we'd like to share another poll for you to answer. So if the poll can go up. Loving the results. I think most people would love to be either the Eurasian lynx or the wolf.
I regret that my favorite one, the Iberian lynx, is not there, but that's okay.
Well, thank you so much. That was very interesting. Now, we did get a lot of questions from the participants and the attendees, but there were a few questions that I wanted to ask both you and Nestor, you and Michael, and maybe I can start with you, Nestor. Why is it so important to restore natural ecological processes, in your opinion?
So, the very traditional views of ecological restoration have been focusing almost exclusively on structural components, that is restoring trees or restoring species, which is very important, for example, for endangered species. But we need to start recognizing that those species play ecological functions, and those ecological functions at the same time provide the sustain to preserve the ecosystems and the species themselves. So ecological functions, like for example, primary productivity, they are improved with higher diversity of certain species. But also many of those species provide important, many of those species and ecological processes provide important services to humans, like for example, the capacity to sequester carbon. So it is more and more recognized that natural functioning forests are able to capture much more carbon than plantations, but also the role of large herbivores when they are at sufficient densities to increase the landscape heterogeneity and control, for example, the amount of fuel that is in scrublands and in forests, and then contribute to the prevention of fires and many other systems that are important. So we need to start considering biodiversity as a multifunctional characteristic that is not only about the species, it's not only about the trees, it's about all the functions and all the complex interactions that, that they bring.
Thank you so much. And I'm sure that's going to spur more questions. But I wanted to bring in Michael and ask a question to you. Do you think restoration and rewilding can be a motor for recovery post-COVID? Most specifically, could you share your view on the objectives set in the biodiversity strategy on afforestation? Is it the silver bullet that some people want to make us believe? Michael, what do you think of that?
Yeah, it's not an easy question, I can tell you, and especially in regard with the afforestation, because I really have to say that I see it very similarly as Nestor already mentioned. I'm not a big fan of afforestation at all, and especially in the regard when we see it as a way of restoring forest or even gaining more area or forested areas. Because definitely a forest is not only about trees, and you cannot plant a forest by planting trees. There are still so many crucial processes needed to be involved in order to get a forest, that afforestation usually when being done in regard with creating a forest is always a failure. Or usually a failure. You only produce a plantation that will last there until it will collapse, and then finally a process that can really buildup the forest may start. So afforestation is, to me, is a good tool until we really consider its real potential, and that is that we are planting individual trees, and those trees should really serve in a certain way to human society or maybe nature. So I like to see afforestation in the urban areas. I like to see afforestation in agricultural areas, and I hate to see afforestation in forest areas. That's probably my response to that. But in regards to the post-COVID recovery of economy, whether the afforestation should be seen as a tool, or maybe the rewilding should be seen as a tool, that's probably a very different story. I really always have been very keen to see the rewilding as a necessary process for the establishment and support of ecological tourism, so to say. So really to have the chance to come to a certain area and have a chance to see a bison or a lynx or a wolf. That's something that I think many of, or majority of the European people would really love to see. And there is a big demand on such, well, say, services. And usually really to have, or to regain the possibility to really encounter these magnificent species is not possible without restoring of their habitat and their population, and in these terms to rewild as a certain part of our countryside in order to really have this chance. So in this regard, I think that a functionist and really attractive ecological tourism should really work as a good opportunity for an area or a region or local people to really revive after the COVID crisis, especially when before the COVID crisis they were mainly dependent on harvesting of wood or whatever activity they were doing. So in this regard, I see the rewilding and the bringing the nature back on the map as probably one of the crucial options that we have in order to restore our economy and really do it in the Green Deal way.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and that makes sense to me at least. We'll see what others have to say. But thank you for that. And I think just because looking at the time, we should really be moving on. So we see the questions that are being asked, and there will be time for us to pose these questions to all the panelists and also to MEP Vezek. So just don't be disappointed. We will try to raise as many questions as we can. Next, we have Barbara Herrero, who is the EU Biodiversity Officer at BirdLife Europe, and she will be talking to us or giving the NGO's point of view on the Commission's legal proposal. So over to you, Barbara.
Hello, everyone. Hope you can hear me and see me well. I'm going to share my screen. Bear with me a second. Now, it should go on presenter view. There we go. So as Mira introduced me, I'm Barbara Herrero Cangas. I'm the EU Policy Officer at BirdLife Europe and Central Asia. And yes, I want to share with you some thinking that some people in the NGOs in Brussels have been giving to how we can make, how we can actually put nature back on the map. You will see a few images that you've already seen in Nestor's presentation. We've been working together in this project, so I guess that's normal. But basically, what we've seen on the maps of degradation that Nestor talked about earlier, that the picture is dismal. We need nature everywhere. Wherever we look, There is fragmentation, there are trophic chains that have been destroyed, ecological processes have been degraded beyond recognition, and we are basically using the land and sea, for that matter, far too intensively, and we need to change that. There is a ray of light, so first the Green Deal, then the biodiversity strategy presented earlier this year. The European Commission has promised a legally binding instrument to restore nature in the EU. And I think this is our single biggest opportunity to actually start bringing back nature. But let's not forget that we've already had multiple chances to do this in a flexible way. Last time, as a continent, we promised to do something about restoration. It was last decade, where we were going to restore 15% of degraded land. And let's be very honest, nothing has happened, at least not on the scale that is needed. We cannot blow it again. We need to develop a legal system that is able to deal with the urgency that we're facing. So the Commission has said that they will propose new legislation by the end of 2021, but we cannot afford to go into 10, 20, 30 years of discussions on methodologies and how do we exactly mean that nature should look like. Whatever it is they propose, it needs to be simple enough conceptually so that it allows actual restoration works to start on the ground as soon as possible. How we think this could work is that the binding instrument needs to come with measurable, concrete targets, area-based, for instance. So it needs to make concrete that 15% of area that was promised, or degraded land that was promised 10 years ago, into the equivalent of land and seas. So on land, that would be about 650,000 square kilometers. At sea, it would be about 1 million square kilometers. And we need to restore those into high quality nature. Achieving this quality on enough area of land and seas needs to be the primary objective of the legislation, high quality nature. The Commission needs to make sure that the existing acquis is not compromised, but reinforced and complemented by this new restoration legislation, and helps deliver the Birds and Habitats Directives, the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, and the Water Framework Directive. Much like there are climate policies, different climate policies that work together to help member states address climate change, energy efficiency, carbon emission reductions, renewable energy legislation. We need something that reinforces the existing system. Because we cannot forget that we are in a dual crisis. This is the climate and biodiversity crisis. The area-based targets, therefore, we think should be accompanied by carbon sequestration targets achieved in the high quality nature restored. Because if it's not high quality nature, it wouldn't be able to count. Because we don't only need to sequester carbon, and this goes back to the question on forests and complex ecosystems within the forests. We need to store carbon in the long run, and that's only feasible in resilient ecosystems, which are brought by the complexity of the ecosystem. With these two objectives, biodiversity, climate change, action, we think that there are broad habitat types that should be restored. These are wetlands and peatlands, sea meadows and forests, old growth forests, and biodiversity rich grasslands, broadly speaking. So yes, nature is a complex creature. And so to deliver this primary goal, this high quality nature, as we've heard from Nestor's presentation, we need to increase the connectivity. And that's why we think that restoration will need to happen both inside and outside the Natura 2000 network, depending on how the different countries have organized their Natura 2000 sites, and always on top of current legal management requirements. So if last year you plowed your biodiversity rich grassland that was protected and made an asparagus plantation, you restore that, wouldn't count because you shouldn't have converted it in the first place. But if you've designated a eucalyptus plantation as part of a broader Natura 2000 site with dehesas, and you transform that eucalyptus plantation into a dehesa, that might very well be able to count towards this target. So basically we need member states, the legislation to ask member states to make a plan where they say where they want to do the restoration, what they're going to restore, how they plan to restore their nature, and what co-benefits it will bring in terms of enhancement of the Natura 2000, its network, its cohesiveness, climate change mitigation and adaptation, water retention, etc. Obviously, the Commission would then need to check and approve that those plans are going to deliver in due time, because we also need those plans to come with deadlines. As I said before, we don't have the luxury of time. We need to have a plan and have finished enabling it by the end of this decade. Obviously, an old growth forest will have to grow for 100 years or more, but we need to have planted the seeds already by the end of before 2030. We need to have a trajectory that the member states, to make sure that member states will deliver on time. And so all these maps, and specifically this map that we've produced within this project, will help member states inform their restoration process and will provide member states the tools that they need to make those decisions. We have to focus to make this happen. Our house is on fire. You saw the state of the environment report last year. Today, the Living Planet report was released. The state of nature report that's coming in a couple of months is really not going to be a surprise. We all know what the state is. It's horrible. So our house is on fire. We cannot afford to spend another decade discussing and not doing. We need to call the fire brigade now. We need to wake up and smell the coffee. With this legislation on restoration, we need to make European countries invest in their nature and our future. We will not do it by covering the EU with Sitka spruce plantations. Those will die with climate change. But we need this regulation to set concrete and measurable targets that are legally binding, that puts high quality nature back on the map, and fast. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Barbara, and thank you so much for stating so clearly what is required from the EU. So with that, I would like to invite our panelists for a panel debate that we're going to have. So we're going to have a panel with us, and I'll be posing some questions. We have Jakob Weert from DG Environment, European Commission, who coordinates the European Commission's proposal on the legally binding instrument on restoration. We have Professor Enrique Pereira, who's also from the German Center for Integrative Biodiversity Research. We have Sabine Liemans, the Senior Biodiversity Officer at WWF. And then we have Pedro Prata, Team Leader of the Western Iberia Rewilding Europe. So if you could all switch your cameras on and have your microphones on, that would be great. Thank you. So welcome, and you've been hearing the discussion so far and seeing the presentations. So I guess my first question would be for Jakob. What is the current state of development of the legislative proposal? And can you give us an idea of the EC's current thinking?
Sure. First of all, I hope you can hear me and you can see me.
Yes, we can.
That's great. So I just want to backtrack a little bit to the biodiversity strategy that was mentioned quite a lot. First of all, that has, four main parts, I would say, and some of them were alluded to in some of the previous presentations. The first part is about protecting nature and proposes, 30% protection and 10% specific high protection. It proposes, secondly, a big activity on restoration, which I'll talk about more. Also about enabling transformative change, also through the economy and through fiscal systems, and also about acting globally on the world scene. And of course, next year is going to be the CBD. So just to paint that picture in the background, so that the EU's proposal on legally binding restoration targets fits into that second category of nature restoration. And what the Commission proposal says, now I'm getting a message that my connection may be a little bit unstable, so I may switch myself off, but you can continue to hear me.
Yes, we can.
So as I was saying, I'll just continue like that, just in case. Essentially, there is the proposal on legally binding targets in this strategy, and that says that in 2021, the Commission will put forward a proposal for nature restoration targets of degraded ecosystems, and in particular those with the most potential to capture carbon, store carbon, and reduce the impact of future natural disasters. It also says that this will identify conditions by which these targets should be met, and also look at an overall EU methodology to be able to start assessing in a more comprehensive manner ecosystem condition and health of ecosystems, as well as their services. So I think that's worth backtracking to. That's what the strategy says. So what we've been discussing since then has been how to bring forward this legal proposal. Now, there's no Commission decision on that yet, but already, as you can see, timing is quite short. So internally, we've been starting quite a lot of the processes to set up. If we want to propose a new legal instrument, we have to go through a very rigorous impact assessment. Any new law has to be very strictly examined of its various impacts environmental, social, and economic. And so this is a big undertaking that we're starting now, and hopefully we'll be able to launch a very large study on that. And that study will guide us on the kinds of targets that can be set and what their impacts would be from social, economic, and environmental perspectives. Now, the types of targets can be set could include targets on a species, it could include a target on a habitat, or could include a more generic target. I think if I can also come back to what this legal proposal will have to build on. We already have a big environmental acquis. We already have what was mentioned, the Habitats and Birds Directives, the Water Framework Directive, and the Marine Strategic Framework Directive. So any proposal will have to build on these in an intelligent way. Because currently, in those pieces of legislation, there are very few targets that are actually set, and time-bound targets. For example, in the Birds Habitats Directives, there are no time-bound targets. In the other directives that I mentioned, there are targets, but they're very broad. So at the same time, the good news is that a lot of the methodologies for monitoring and data acquisition is already in place for those areas covered by existing legislation. However, we also have to bear in mind, I'm going to start my video again, just unless I get a signal that it's going faulty. It's also it's very important to consider that current legislation doesn't cover all ecosystems, and there's quite a lot of gaps. So, for example, current legislation doesn't cover soils explicitly. It doesn't cover a certain amount of grasslands. It doesn't cover pollinators as a specific species. It doesn't cover intensively managed forests or forest plantations, I think that were mentioned as well. So somehow, in our thinking anyway, we want to be fairly broad in this thinking of what needs to be covered. Why do we need to do this? Well, one of the reasons is, one of the objectives in the strategy, it says that by 2050, all of Europe's ecosystems would be in relatively good condition. So that's a long-term vision, and it's a broad vision. So that means that we have to consider aspects of ecosystems that are currently covered by legislation, but we should not forget about those that are also not covered by current legislation. By covered, I mean, there is no target for many of these anyway, but what I mean is that there isn't, in some cases, there is a very strong foundation for data and measurement and monitoring techniques that are already in place. So I think that's an important message I wanted to underline. And I think in our analysis as well, what we have to prove, in a sense, in this impact analysis, is what was mentioned, that these voluntary targets of 15% up to now have not been particularly successful, and only a few member states put forward key restoration plans. And so we have to come up with how and why legally binding targets will in reality bring about change in this kind of impact analysis exercise, and what the costs and benefits would be. Restoration costs, but also there are benefits. And these are the kinds of things that we will have to, with the help of our study, examine in a lot more detail. And just as one last thing I want to say, part of the process that the Commission is putting forward a proposal, we will be holding an open public consultation. So there will be a range of questions that will be asked with respect to potentially legal targets on restoration. And these would be open for at least, I think, 3 months. And we're hoping that this would be able to be launched later this year. So that's an important thing, I think, to keep your eye out on, because that will also influence some of the decisions that come at the end. Well, in reality, which targets are really important and why? And why should we have a legal proposal for a specific target on X or Y or Z? So that gives you a kind of an overview of our thinking. As I said, the strategy paints these things. It puts out that the Commission will make a proposal in 2021, but still there's discussion now, and the Commission has not yet actually put forward a specific decision on this proposal yet. So it is still being discussed internally, and all these procedures that I talked about will be very instrumental in helping form actual proposal as it's made, as well as the views and opinions of everybody, and including in this conference. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jakob. And then we'll make sure that we remind people of the various deadlines, I'm sure. I'd like to bring in Sabine. Sabine, my question to you would be, where is restoration most needed? Can restoration be equitably distributed around Europe? And what do you mean by restoration? Can you give a few examples?
Yes, thank you, Mira, and good afternoon to everybody. It was already mentioned by Nestor earlier that today the Living Planet report was launched, and actually it was quite sad to see the very big decline in species populations that we see globally, and it really shows the urgency that we need to step up our actions to protect biodiversity. And to me, it's very clear that we need to restore nature in Europe everywhere across Europe. Because healthy ecosystems are crucial fundament for our well-being. So we cannot say that some regions should restore more while other regions could take a backseat. When Nestor presented the map, he showed priority areas for conservation and restoration, taking into account the connectivity, improving the connectivity of the existing protected area network that we have in Europe. And this is an important element for deciding where to start restoring ecosystems. And the other element is, of course, the link with climate change. We know that the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis are two sides of the same coin. And so nature restoration is one of the solutions to prevent runaway climate change. On the other hand, climate change is causing biodiversity loss. So we can focus on ecosystems that can play a role in this being carbon sinks, but also ecosystems that help us to adapt to a changing climate and protect us from floods and help with water retention. And the third element, and this is the one that I want to underline a bit more here, is the looking at it through the lens of bringing nature closer to people. Because we all know that reconnecting people to nature is contributing to their well-being. And it was also showed when the research was presented that you can use this criterion of nature close to people to highlight which cities still have high quality nature around them and where restoring this is urgently needed. So we cannot say that in some regions protecting people from climate change is more important than in others. So that's why for me it's very clear that nature restoration needs to happen everywhere. And so we strongly advocate for the legally binding restoration targets to be distributed equally across member states, because this will also help to avoid very lengthy discussions just about the effort sharing of this target. And it would be a pity to lose a lot of time on this discussion, why we know the urgency is very big. Regarding examples, I think some have been given already, but maybe when you look at the marine area, for instance, actually restoring in the marine area, the main thing that we need to do there is to stop the negative impacts we have on marine biodiversity. So that means establishing no-take zones, and that's a very, very effective way to restore biodiversity and make the marine area also again more resilient. Another example is re-wetting peatlands so that they can start taking up their role again as carbon sinks, while they are now emitting tons of carbon into the atmosphere because they are degraded. And I think there are many examples like this, removing barriers in rivers to let them free flowing again, to help fish migration, restore floodplains to do flood prevention, as I mentioned earlier. And all these can be done quite quickly if we would have numerical targets based on those, and it would really have a big impact immediately on the ground, not only for nature, but also for the people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sabine. And I really loved your point about how this also enhances people's well-being. So thank you for bringing that in. I wanted to ask Pedro next. Can you give us briefly your perspective from Portugal? How can we ensure that local communities benefit from ecological restoration? And this is something that I'm personally interested into, working for local communities.
Yes, well, hello everyone first. And locally, that's where the theory meets practice. So that's where the action takes place, and where we're working when we're showing those corridors. We're actually on the western end of one of those corridors, and for the past 30 years, people have been responding to stimulus. Actually, people respond a lot better to stimulus than to prohibition or to this kind of regulation. And so far, over the 30 years, I've seen this landscape change because there was stimulus in that way. And it's a matter of putting in place the right stimulus that allow people to respond to it, and the results will come. And that's what we're looking for, to have results, and as a outcome of the stimulus. So we were very curious to know what's going to be the practical stimulus coming from this new legislation, because on the ground that will really mark the difference between achieving goals or not. And these should be focused on a lot of the things that people already mentioned, but the soil and how soils can sink carbon, how soils can infiltrate water and hydrate landscape, and how this can then benefit the biodiversity as a whole, and also the bioabundance of the species in this renaturalized, rewilded landscape. And for all of that, what I think is really important is actually to communicate with people properly what is the goal, so they know what they are standing for as acting on the ground. We do a lot of that on the ground because we want to achieve a more rewilded landscape, but it's not just for the NGOs on the ground trying to pave the way for the Commission or the whole society. So people need to know what they're looking for, what the results might be, and how they can see those results as owned, as identify with those results. And I think that makes a lot of the difference between having solid results that meet the goals, and not just another way to fulfill whatever people might find as what is the subsidy system now in place, leading them that way. So it's a lot of that prideness in the landscape where they live that will make sure that this lasts for longer time as intended.
Thank you so much. And I think that makes a lot of sense, at least from the community perspective. I'd like to bring in Enrique. My question to you is, can restoration policies based on rewilding also contribute to climate mitigation? And I think we've had similar questions to that in the chat.
Is yes. The long answer is, how do you achieve large-scale restoration? We know there has been several estimates that suggest that the amount of carbon that is not sequestered every year. For instance, in my own group, we published a paper last year on that. The amount of carbon is not sequestered because we are using landscapes for agricultural production and other uses, is around half of the total emissions of CO2. So we are losing a huge potentially globally of carbon sequestration. There's also other estimates that say that if you would promote large-scale ecological restoration, you could sequester up to 2/3 of the accumulated emissions on the atmosphere. Now, the challenge is on how to do this. And here it is where we have to avoid repeating the error of the past. In about 100 years ago, most countries in Europe had large-scale national afforestation projects. The reasons for those projects range from a historical point of view, because when they happened, they were also addressing serious ecological and environmental problems that we already were facing at the end of the 19th century, like, you know, not having enough timber, not having enough wood fuel, soil erosion, sediment in rivers, and so on. And most countries in Europe started large-scale afforestation projects with typically coniferous species. Now, after 9 years, we know that these projects have some success, but they also have several failures. And we cannot repeat afforestation as we were doing 100 years ago. Monocultures, fast-growing species, pioneer species, for timber production. This is, first, it's not ecologically sound. We know now that we have other problems. We have low biodiversity in many of these monocultures. We have fire risk in many of these areas, and pest risk, etc. In one hand, we know that, and on the other hand, it's also not the most cost-effective way of doing restoration. This required large programs with large funding for doing this afforestation. What we need is ways of doing large-scale ecological restoration that is cost-effective, and that's where rewilding, where we promote natural processes and we allow space for nature to take care of itself instead of managing it all the time. That's where rewilding provides a series of solutions to do large-scale restoration that is good both for biodiversity, because we're restoring ecological processes, we're restoring connectivity, we're restoring trophic complexity, but also we're also increasing the potential carbon sequestration every year in European landscapes if we do this well. And it's very important, in my opinion, and I really look forward to the development of this restoration legislation, that part of that legislation is rewilding friendly. And what it means rewilding friendly is that it will allow for restoration of natural processes, natural landscapes without prefixed habitats that has to be maintained, and that is associated with a series of stimuli. Like Pedro was saying, people reply very fast to stimuli. Stimuli in the common agricultural policy that will support this kind of restoration by farmers, foresters, where we allow nature to allow ecological succession, and we also manage ecological succession, because in the beginning, nature needs often a lot of help, and to start these processes going, you need to remove the dams, as Sabine was saying, or you need to develop the seed bank, because in many cases the seed bank for the native trees are not there. you may need to reintroduce some species that are missing, some keystone species. So this needs a lot of help, but the long-term goal is that you don't need to manage that every year in the future. Then the processes will manage themselves.
Thank you so much. I have another question for Jakob, and then I would like to bring some of the other panelists, speakers back into the panel. Jakob, how do you ensure that any future ecological restoration legislation builds on and supports the current nature directives?
Sure. I think that's an important question, and I kind of alluded to it a little bit in what I had already said, in that we have an environmental acquis, a basis of a lot of nature restoration, and that we have to be able to build on that in a clever way. So that means that we could imagine, let's say, relatively easily, targets, for example, for wetlands, for peatlands, for certain types of forests, for rivers, because they already have a support basis of monitoring, of reporting in place. The strategy, for example, itself makes a proposal of saying, well, we should restore 25,000 kilometers of rivers. So that's an example, and that is a subset, let's say, of a river ecosystem, and it will benefit that river ecosystem, and it's a subset of generic, broader freshwater ecosystems. So we can have these targets that can help push forward a specific aspect of restoration. And I wanted to come back to the word, I think it was Pedro used. He said, you know, we need the stimulus. Yeah, a target can act as a stimulus for action. And I think we've seen, and this is a bit my personal view, that sometimes if you have massively broad generic targets, they sometimes may not yield sufficient results. So sometimes you need a stimulus on a specific aspect of an ecosystem. It could be a specific species. It could be a specific aspect, like I talked about river continuity. It could be about the levels of pollinators. It could be other things that act as this stimulus. And thinking about that will be very important in thinking about the right kinds of targets. Sometimes a target like that might be more effective than saying we want all water bodies in the EU to be restored. In a sense, that's the objective of the Water Framework Directive, which is fine. But if targets provide stimulus, and I think we're going to have to be exploring how they can do that in a clever way. And as I said earlier, that can build on existing legislation. And in other cases, it has to be open to looking at areas for which legislation does not provide you with that, all that data and monitoring, etc. I mean, just to give you an example, we launched the Pollinators Initiative last year. And I mean, the work now is ongoing to start developing what would be the various monitoring methodologies, you know, that you can have to put into place in Europe to be able to assess whether pollinators are in decline. That's not trivial. I mean, there are methods, transect methods, and you measure, and capture methods, and so on. Okay, but that has to be then somehow standardized, or you know, made accessible across all of the EU in a clever way. So there is a lot of work of that nature to be done if you go into an area for which there is no current legislation. So I mentioned soils or other areas. But we have to keep all of these in play. So yes, building on current legislation in a sense is a kind of form of low-hanging fruit, but we shouldn't dismiss the other areas for which targets need to be developed, perhaps in the longer term, over a longer period of time, but they need to be pointed at or addressed. Yeah.
Thank you so much for
all of these can act as stimuli, and this is the important thing about a target, I think.
Mm-hmm. I would like for others to maybe react to that, but I would request Michael and Barbara and Nestor to join the panel. And then if anybody wants to react to Jakob's last point.
So maybe I can start. Okay. I really cannot agree more with what Jakob already said. There are some legislation frameworks which can be used in this regard, and we still are missing some, and especially the binding legislation is really crucially needed, both on the European level and at the national level. But to me, very promising is really the concept of the biodiversity strategy and the goal to really have 10% of the surface area and 10% of the marine area to be strictly protected by the 2030. And especially when we really consider that these 10% should encompass all existing, well, primary forest remnants and all old growth forests, which have to be before that defined. So I think that these 10% will really be those hotspots of rewilding, so to say, because if you really have to protect them strictly, you have to protect them free of any human intervention, I would say, or classical traditional intervention. And that's the conditions that really support the natural regeneration processes, the secondary succession, the let's say restoration of natural processes and natural the population of wild species, and all that stuff will be included in there. But still, in this very moment, this is just a strategy, and we are really missing well, addressing this issue in the terms of legally binding issues or measures, and I really hope for them to really be there. But it will be quite a problematic process. I can see it right now, for instance, in the issue regarding with CAP reform. It's really it is a messy and very complex fight, so to say, because there is really a very strong willingness to keep the business as usual as possible, so to say. And I really don't see really too much effort being put into the reform in order to improve the situation with the biodiversity on that stuff. And it really has to be done also in there within the CAB reform, because so many or such a huge budget is fixed on the so-called climate money and so-called biodiversity climate within the CAP, that it really cannot be done only by small improvements in the business as usual, and we really cannot stick to some sort of a greenwash. But I'm quite afraid that in the current proposal that comes from the Agri Committee, that's exactly the case. So I really have to believe that there will be also a shift in the paradigm of Parliament, and hopefully, and I really have to praise Commission in this regard. They are really sending a very clear signal and message towards the Parliament, what should be somehow followed and done. But I hope that the Parliament will really be at least that green as it has been until now. So even in these very, very crucial moments of CAB reform and biodiversity strategy application and all that stuff. So yeah, let's hope for that.
Thank you so much. I think there are two more quick reactions, one from Barbara and another from Enrique. So Barbara, go ahead.
That's quite encouraging, Mr. Wijik. But Jakob, I just wanted to point out that addressing all of those needs that you mentioned, so the habitats that I mentioned and the soils and the pollinators don't need to be mutually exclusive. It's just that we need to focus. We need to concentrate on what can actually be done in the next couple of years, not more. If we start discussing how to measure the the well-being of all ecosystems, which are tremendous and very difficult ecological discussions that experts don't agree with, we will not have an instrument ready to be implemented in 2 years' time. So what we're saying is that why don't we use what we already have? We have favorable conservation status, for instance, from the Habitats Directive that we can use to measure those habitats that we can measure with the methodologies that are already available. So just wanted to point out that they're not mutually exclusive. It's just that right now we need to look concretely to what we can do in the short term.
Thanks, Barbara. Enrique?
Well, just wanted to highlight and strengthen or complement what Michael has said about the 10% strict protection target. I think this is the most important development in the last 10 years in the EU biodiversity strategy. You know, as you know, we had already a strategy for 2020. We have now this strategy that it goes to 2030. And this is from my point of view, the single most important development. Because it's the first time in the European Union that we have a clear target for protection of intact ecosystems or for rewilding ecosystems. It can be seen in both ways. And this is important because just having a percentage target like 30% of protected area, for me, is not very meaningful personally. Because in reality, I think the target for protection should be 100%. All landscapes in Europe have to be managed in a sustainable and biodiversity friendly way. All the landscapes. But at least some landscapes, and the target now is 10%, at least some of the landscapes should be left for nature to manage itself. And this is so important that I cannot highlight enough the importance of this. What I wanted to suggest is that we also try to, at the global level, and the European Commission also pushes for a similar target at the global level. Because now the discussion at the global level for the post-2030 and the Convention of Biological Diversity is also the same kind of 30% of protected areas. And there's even this discussion of half for Earth, full Earth. I think at the global level is the same issue. We should have some targets for strict protected areas. For other protected areas that is non-strict protected, but also we should make all landscapes on the planet biodiversity friendly.
Thank you so much. So now I'll move on to some of the questions that we've gotten from the participants. A lot of them are for Michael Wiesek. So I'll pose one of the most upvoted ones first to you. One of the challenges ahead for the rewilding agenda, and this is by Boris Bravo, agenda is that the need to decouple rewilding from social economic decline, i.e. poverty. People, especially in least developed regions of the EU, are not likely to support the rewilding agenda unless we prove otherwise. We need more examples of where wild nature and human well-being coexist. What can we do about it?
Yeah, that's a crucial and very good question. And I fully agree that we cannot persuade the people, especially from the not that rich regions in Europe, that when doing nothing that will actually improve their situation when they are based on the traditional ways of their livelihood, mainly in a sort of exploitation of the nature potential. So what we really need, and crucial need, are good pilots in this regard. Good examples of good practice that really can show us with no doubt that there is another way of exploiting the nature in a sort of a non-exploitative way. And I really think that there are already such cases throughout Europe that really prove that this is really an option for us. The Bavarian forest, for instance, it usually or traditionally was normal forested area used for timber production. But as we all know, it changed its direction. Now it is a strictly protected natural area where the income for the local communities and the overall general economic effectivity of this special management is 10 times higher than it was previously when it was traditionally used, or maybe not 10 times, but definitely way higher than it was before it was used traditionally to produce timber. And I cannot stress it more, but there really is a demand throughout the Europe for a wild nature, for a unique and really like as complex as possible and wild nature, because we really need also this aspect of the existence, not only to be in our controlled environment, but also to experience the uncontrolled natural environment from where we originally originated, so to say. So I would really stress for those people who are hesitating whether they should cut their forest or protect it and bring in some visitors. Just try both ways and compare them. Keep your reference for that, and don't put everything on a single card. Well, I really think that this could be a very effective tool for the for the regional improvement. There are some instances that this way really works. Give it a try. Yeah, that's probably what I would suggest, because there is not much they can lose by it. In fact, they are poor, even though they were cutting their forests and hunting their animals. So let's try the different way. Maybe this time it will work out, but not maybe. I'm sure it will work out. But it really needs a good, let's say, marksmanship or management in order to make it really for the visitors really to believe that this is something that is real, that is really happening, and it's not a sort of a masquerade or a entertaining park or a greenwashing or something like that. It really has to be a real, untamed wild nature, and it will work for its own. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I see a lot of heads nodding, at least in the panel. I have another question, which is not particularly addressed to anyone, but it's more about so feel free to raise your hand and answer it. What do you think could and should be the role of technology and tech companies to support rewilding? Who would like to take that? Go ahead, Enrique.
I can take that because we just, a colleague of mine and I just had a project. Unfortunately, he didn't have the funding yet for doing it. But it is an example of what kind of tech companies could do on these. And there is a lot of the social networking component and web-based component where there is so much to do. So we have the following challenge sometimes in Europe. Anyone that has been in some restoration, for instance, if you want to plant native trees where there is no native trees because they've not been around, they've been replaced by exotic plantations, and you want to start planting native trees, you face in many places in Europe, you don't even know where to, first, what species are native in your area. You don't know where you can buy native trees, and you don't know where you can plant them. And so César Capinha at the University of Lisbon started this platform where people that have land that want to donate to native tree plantation can donate the land. People that citizen scientists can go there and choose volunteers to go there and plant these native trees. And tree growers that grow native trees from the region can advertise. And you can also know what native trees exist in your, or should be occurring in your region. So it's combining all of this information in a web platform. We applied this last year to the biodiverse, and we were not able to get funding, unfortunately. So we're still searching for funding for this project. So if there's a tech company that, for instance, would like to pick up on these kind of ideas, I think the idea is the important thing. And this is one idea, but there are many other types of ideas where tech companies can leverage the social networks to engage the European citizens, both in the knowledge of nature, in providing more knowledge, more monitoring data into what's happening to nature, but also in nature restoration. Another app I like to mention is the iNaturalist app that has been so powerful. And today anyone can, with an iNat, can take a photo. It has an automated image recognition where it will identify the species it is. It pushes all the observations that have been confirmed by experts to GBIF, to the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. Again, tech companies could support all of this kind of work that is being done by scientists and conservationists around Europe.
Thank you so much for that. We have a question addressed to Dr. Fernandez. And the question is from Sarah Brady, and it is, I understand from your research and presentation that you have focused mainly on why and where what should be rewilded. And I think engaging people is crucial to establish how rewilding. So what is the best way, do you suggest, to engage people in this? And do you have any suggestions from your experiences?
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously critical. So from a scientific point of view, one of the works we are doing right now is working on participatory scenarios for rewilding. So participatory scenarios are kind of tools that allow you to discuss with the stakeholders, local people, policymakers, managers, and so on, how are the futures that they see for conservation in a given area. And one of we are doing with students here at iDiv, a PhD student, a review of how participatory scenarios are depicting restoration and the future of biodiversity. And it's quite surprising that very rarely those scenarios actually speak about restoration at all. It's mostly about conservation. It's about how to manage wetlands in a way that is sustainable for both preserving the wetland, but also to make some uses and so on, but very, very few about restoration. So I think that's one of the ways that we need to explore in science, how to develop participatory scenarios for restoration and specifically also for rewilding, and how can we transmit those opinions of stakeholders in terms of projections to the future. So how would the area look like in the future according to the different perceptions of the people? Yeah, that's, yeah.
Thank you so much. One last question that I'll pick up from the Q&A and from our participants. And I think it's quite an interesting one, and it's not addressed to anyone in particular, so please feel free to raise your hand and answer. It is from Heather Brooks from EuroCities. What is the potential in focusing on health and nature? COVID has highlighted the inequities in access to the green spaces in cities and the correlation to poor health, in particular mental health. How can we capitalize on the health implications of nature to move towards access to nature as a right and not a privilege? And I think this is something that Sabine also touched on, the well-being. So maybe you'd like to address that, Sabine?
Yes, I'm not an expert in health issues, but I think we all experienced it ourselves during the quarantine period. We all experienced that we really had the urgency and the feeling that we needed to be able to go outside and to be in nature, to recover and to feel ourselves better. Apologies. And so this has really indicated and underlined this need that we know is already there, and there is a lot of links with social inequalities, people living in cities who have in small apartments, and the importance to have green spaces there. And of course, this is not something that we have been working on now with this study, because we were looking at nature outside of the city. But of course, greening cities, having access to biodiversity-rich parks and water spaces, etc. I think there is a lot of studies that have been done that shows the health benefits of this. And I think the biodiversity strategy also mentions this as one of the points that the Commission would like to follow up on. So I'm sure the whole COVID experience will also stimulate local authorities and mayors even more than they are already in the past to look at this agenda and making cities greener as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I know there were two other comments, so one from Barbara and from Pedro. So Barbara, if you don't mind, I'd like to bring in Pedro first, because he also could relate that to the tech, and then you could have the last word, and then we move on to Franz Keppers.
Yeah, thank you. Well, first, regarding the tech involvement in the rewilding efforts, I think there's a lot to be done. Actually, the solutions that we need from the tech companies are usually not available yet, because this is not something that drives their main focus of interest to develop these technologies. For instance, we have this action to promote a much larger natural grazing effect throughout the landscape, and to do so, we have envisioned that some kind of virtual fencing that could lead the herds into not coming into conflict in places that they shouldn't move in would be a already available technology. And once we start looking for it, we learned that basically there was nothing on the market yet ready to be used. And we've contacted a few companies that are actually trying to develop something, but it's for cattle breeders. It's not working for us. So and this would be a solution that would increase a lot the effect of the natural grazing throughout the landscape without providing even more fences around the landscape and more blockage and fragmentation of the landscape. And so it's not driving the solutions in the right way. And so if they want to pay attention sometimes to these kind of questions, I think these type of solutions would be easily solved. So that was my comment on the tech companies' involvement. And the other one is about how the health and this post-COVID reaction or how people perceive their interest in the wilder nature as a need for their well-being. Well, during the quarantine and after it, here at least around where I work and live, I noticed that there was a lot of more people coming. They were trying to avoid the city centers, trying to avoid the crowded places. So their interest is immediately changed toward these areas. So there was a lot of people visiting. I went to the national park in the north of the country, as it is, and was packed with people. And so there is the interest. I think we need to prepare also for this growing interest, not to be an impact. But there is this interest, and people want more. So people want to see a wilder nature. They don't like to go into natural areas and as seldom happens here, see plantations of eucalyptus or pine trees, seeing the effects of fire, not seeing much wildlife at all. So working to a more rewilded landscape will meet those expectations. And if it's regulated in a way that is not harmful and impactful, then there is a room for people to experience it.
Thank you so much. Barbara?
Yeah, no, I think that that's an extremely important question. I think, I mean, as Sabine said, bringing, and Pedro said also, bringing nature closer to the people is extremely important. The one thing I wanted to also point out is that within BirdLife, we are part of a group of many organizations pushing for a new universal rights. So basically the right to a healthy planet, of which obviously restoration and nature conservation is part of. And I will put the link on this on the chat for everyone who's interested to support our petition and try to get that through at UN level. At BirdLife Europe and Central Asia, we're working more on the European decision makers, and obviously everyone involved here is working from the local to national to global levels. So I just wanted very briefly to say that.
Thank you so much. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone on the panel and for your insight and comments and sharing your experiences and thought. That was really, really valuable. We just have a few minutes remaining, and I wanted to ensure that we have enough time for our keynote speaker, closing speaker, who is Franz Schepper, the Managing Director of Rewilding Europe. And he'll be giving kind of a wrap up and addressing some of the key points. So over to you, Franz.
Yeah, thank you. And very nice to have so many people from so many countries and backgrounds participating in this webinar. I think the timing couldn't have been more actual with the Living Planet report coming out today. And the message there was very clear: nature is our ally and not our enemy. And what I would like to do is just give you a broad overview of sort of the main findings of our conversations, which were basically around how do we put nature back on the map in Europe, or if you like, how do we make the Green Deal really work for nature? How do we do that? And I think we focus today on how we can boost ecological restoration at scale in Europe. And some of the main conclusions or findings of our discussions of today are, I'm going to mention a few the most important ones, I think. First of all, nature provides solutions for both the biodiversity and the climate emergencies. I think that has been addressed, and I really think that the nature recovery agenda in Europe that we need to have has to be really strongly linked with the climate movement, because there's a very strong push, and aligning and connecting with that will hopefully bring us much further than just, you know, move on our own from the conservation perspective. And so that involves lots of measures that are complementary and synergistic between the two. And I think what really is important in our discussion today is that we mean in particular the restoration of functional and self-sustained ecosystems. And we don't speak only about forests, that has been addressed, but we also talk about peatlands, wetlands, grasslands, coastal areas, you name it. And this is where rewilding comes in as a form, as a way of doing ecological restoration that promotes the self-sustained ecosystems, able to provide the services for both nature and people while requiring a minimum management and associated costs. So we talked about ways of doing large-scale landscape restoration. We haven't talked too much about rewilding principles, but those are existing and they are developing over time together with ICN, and other organizations are looking at, could we maybe include some rewilding principles in this new legislation? And of course, the key is to achieve those objectives and targets that we talked about based on the Habitats and Birds Directive and the new EU biodiversity strategy. And if we look at the Natura 2000 network, which is a great asset that we have in Europe, it's unique in the world. But we see there that species and habitats have the primary focus. And we also have to recognize that in most of the Natura 2000 areas, forestry and agricultural interests override that primary focus where Natura 2000 was meant for. And I think we could say that this is unacceptable and basically even in breach with the directives. And it means that policy and financial instruments really have to be reformed to support ecological restoration. And we've also seen that the Natura 2000 network on its own is not enough to restore nature at scale in Europe. The legally enforceable targets for land and sea are really critical, and the landscape connectivity has been mentioned because basically the Natura 2000 network is a number of sites, but there has never been a proper look at how do we create a functional network. And I think the mapping exercise and the presentation from Nestor really showed how important that is. The Ecological Restoration Directive, I think we all agreed, needs to be really ambitious. There is huge urgency and we can't afford ourselves to take years to further develop this. We need something we cannot do without legislation, I would say. There's no doubt that we should not, we should not repeat the targets that we had the last 10 years, which really didn't deliver, and legislation will be very important to help us with that. And I believe that rewilding principles as they are developing should be part of that approach, as also Henrique alluded to. And when the EU member states are going to develop and detail more the national nature recovery plans, those principles can be very useful, and also more detailed mapping as has been done by iDiv. And but I think we should emphasize that it must be accompanied by the reform of some of the perverse policies and subsidies that EU is still providing and is working exactly in the opposite direction. So in short, I would say we do know how we can restore landscapes and nature at scale. We do have that expertise. It's being backed up by more science, and there's no excuse for us to not do it. And I really think that the Green Deal, the biodiversity strategy that we now have, set the right framework for that, are really ambitious, and it now all comes down to the right political decisions, providing that legal support through the new legislation that will hold everyone accountable to it. And I think it should also translate into clear targets in terms of, to clear targets for each country, as I said, but also the financial means and incentives for making that really work in practice. And I think in Europe, and I would like to refer to some of the big landscape restoration initiatives that are happening at the moment through the Endangered Landscapes Program, 8 big programs, not all within the EU. Our own areas in Rewilding Europe, we have already a portfolio of 15 large-scale landscape restoration projects with more to come. And of course, there's many other initiatives that are pioneering change at landscape scale. And I think coming back to the original question, we have to be very careful at restoration. And we see that push from other interests is not going to be degraded into planting some trees and restoring some hedgerows. We really talk about system change and improvement of our landscapes at a large level. So the urgency is there, and we need to make it happen, and we need to act and not think. We always need to keep thinking, but we also need to really take action and make sure that that many initiatives across Europe are going to work and learn as we go, because we cannot know everything in advance. So that would be my sort of summary and closing remarks from our side. And I would like to also thank everyone and you, Mara, to take us through this. And I'm very happy to contribute. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a really great summary. I think you touched upon all the points made. So I'd like to also thank everyone for being here and for participating and providing all these insights. I hope it was something everyone can take something from. And I know there were many questions that we weren't able to get to, but we've recorded them. So hopefully we'll find a way to get back to you on those. But I see that there's a link to the publication that's been shared, so please make sure you get a copy of that. But thank you everyone for joining. We have one last poll for you to do before you go, And we hope that you enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you for being here with us. And thank you to all the panelists and speakers. This was really great.